Pygubu Designer allows you to visually create the graphical part of your Tkinter applications. In this video, I'll show you how to use the check button widget in Pygubu Designer. We will cover how to get the on and off value of a check button with a TK variable and also without a variable. Join me as we continue to explore Pygubu Designer, a graphical user interface tool for Tkinter.
Hi, my name is Jobin, and I'm an open source developer. My channel is called JobinPy, and it's all about Python and Linux. Welcome to JobinPy.
So in this video, I'll show you how check buttons work in Pygubu Designer. Specifically, we'll check to see how we can verify whether a checkbox is checked or whether it's unchecked in code. And we can do this using a variable or without a variable, and I'll show you both ways. So here's my example project. I have a check button at the top, and I have a button at the bottom that says verify. And when I click on the verify button, I want it to detect and tell me whether that checkbox is checked or not. So let's have a closer look at that check button. So that check button is highlighted now. And on the right hand side in the properties section in Pygubu Designer, we have a section here at the bottom that says variable. And we have an on value and an off value. The value of the checkbox, like whether it's checked or not, can get put into a variable that we specify here. So right now, nothing's specified for a variable. So I'm just going to create a variable. I'm going to call it check button underscore value, and it's going to be a string. And the other options that we have are integer, double, and Boolean. Okay, so I'm going to go to the code tab and generate the code, which will be here. Then I'm going to copy it to the clipboard. I'm just going to paste it in my Python IDE. Okay, and we have a method here that says on verify button clicked, and currently it's not doing anything. This method will run whenever this button here is clicked. So in the verify button, I have a command here that says where the callback is on underscore verify underscore button underscore clicked. So that's what this is. Okay, so right now, when the user clicks on this verify button, we want to check to see whether this button is checked or whether it's unchecked. And the value of that check button is put into the variable that we've specified here called check button underscore value. So we need to check the value of that variable to detect whether that check button is checked or unchecked. Okay, so let's do that now. So first of all, when we look at the code, we can see that Pygubu is importing the variables in our project. And right now we only have one variable that we've specified called check button underscore value. And these are variables specific to TK, not to Python, because Tkinter is based on TK, which is the name of the toolkit. And these variables are specific to that. But we can access those variables and create those variables in Python with Tkinter. Okay, so what we're going to do now is when that button is clicked, we're going to print out the value. So we're going to say print self.checkButton underscore value dot get. Okay, so check button value is coming from here. It's importing a variable. And this code here was generated all by Pygubu Designer. This isn't something that was typed out. But we know that the name of the variable is check button underscore value. And we have to run the get method on that variable to get the value. Okay, so let's see what this gives us. Okay, so I'm going to run this and click on verify, and we should see the result down here in the console. So I'm going to click on it, and I haven't clicked the check button yet. Okay, so we're getting an error down here. It says object has no attribute get, and that's because we have to actually save the changes in Pygubu Designer. So that basically means when I created this variable, I didn't save this UI file. I didn't save this project. Okay, so I'm going to go to File, Save. Okay, so now it's been saved. And I'm going to run it again. And I'm going to click on Verify. Okay, so now we saw that it shifted down one line in the console. So it's actually an empty string that it gave us. So now I'm going to check the check button, and I'm going to click on Verify again. It gives us a 1. So when the checkbox is checked, the string variable checkbutton.value has a value of 1. When it's unchecked, it has a value of 0. These are the default values. We can change these values. So what was the very first value that we saw? If we scroll up in the console, there was an empty string here on this line. So that means that the user hasn't decided whether that check button is checked or unchecked. I'm going to run it again so we can see an example. So I haven't clicked on check button. So as far as Tkinter is concerned, this check button is not checked, but it's also not unchecked. So that means if I click on verify again, which is going to print the value of that check button, it's going to give me an empty string. So what can we do about this? It might seem kind of confusing. Now we have to worry about a 0, a 1, and an empty string. Well, I have a better idea. We can go to Pygubu Designer, we can click on the check button, and we should change it from a string to a Boolean, and then save the project. Okay, so we're going to go back into our code. We don't have to change any of the code here, so this code will actually be the same. Then I'm going to run it. The only difference now is that this check button is a Boolean instead of a string. And I'm not going to click on the check button yet. I'm going to click on verify and see what we get. False. So that's automatically better than what we had before. At least we're not getting an empty string. Then I'm going to check that check button, and I'm going to click on verify. True. Then I'm going to uncheck that check button and click on verify. False again. So this is automatically easier. Before I've even checked that check button, it's false. When I check it, it's true. When I uncheck it, it's false. So if you use Boolean, then it's going to be easier to detect whether it's actually checked or not. So that's actually a good way of detecting whether a check button has been checked by the user or not. Another thing you could do is here we can change it back to a string, and we can specify our own off value and our own on value. The default for off is 0, and the default for on is 1. So for the off value as a string, we can say unchecked, and for the on value, we can say checked. Then I'm going to save this project and go back into our IDE. So right now the only difference is we've changed this back to a string, but we've defined our own off value and our own on value. Okay, so let's run this again and see what we get. So I'm not going to click on the check button yet. I'm going to click on verify. There's that empty string again. Then I'm going to check that checkbox. Now we get the word checked. Then I'm going to uncheck that check button, and we get the word unchecked. So this is another way of checking whether a check button is checked or not, is by coming up with your own wording. So that empty string is still useful, because if you want to make sure that your user has actually made a decision, you can check for that empty string. So for example, we can have it do this. I'm going to create a regular Python variable. I'm going to say value equals self.checkbutton underscore value.get. So we're going to get the value and put it into this value variable. Then here we can say if not value, print you have not decided. And let's just run that again to see what we get. So I'm not going to check that checkbox yet. I'm going to click on verify. It says you have not decided. If I check it, nothing happens. It still has the old line on there. If I uncheck it, it doesn't print anything new here either. So this is a good way of making sure that the user has actually changed this value. But if you're not concerned whether the user has changed the value or not, then using Boolean would make more sense, because at that point, even when the user hasn't changed the value of the check button, it would return false. And there's also some other options here too. There's also integer and double. You know, like if we change this to an integer, we can have our own off value of 0 and an on value of 1. And if we save this, and we'll just print the value to see what we get. Okay, so now without deciding, so without actually clicking on that check button, we're getting a 0. And if we check it, we're getting a 1. And if we uncheck it, we're getting a 0 again. And the type of value that we're actually getting will be printed in the console. So we changed it to an integer variable, and now when we click on verify, we're getting an actual integer value. So it's no longer a string. So we're not getting a string of 0 or a string of 1. It's an actual integer. So that's another thing that you can do. And double works pretty much the same way. You would get 1.0, for example. You would have a decimal place if you use double. So if you really wanted to simplify this as much as possible, you would change this to a Boolean and not have a value for on and not have a value for off, and go to your project and say if value print checked, else print not checked. So now it's going to be true and false. So without checking anything, if I click on verify, not checked, checked, we get checked down here. If I uncheck it, we get not checked again. So this would be a very straightforward way of checking whether a check button is actually checked or not. So that's what we can do with the variable property here in Pygubu Designer. But is it possible to check to see if a check button is checked or not without using variables? Is that possible to do? The answer is yes. You don't actually have to use a variable to detect whether a check button is checked or not. And I'll show you how to do that too. So I'm going to remove that variable by just deleting it like that. Then I'm going to save this project. Then I'm going to click on code again and click on generate so we can get some new code without the variable. Copy to clipboard, and we go back in our Python IDE and highlight the code, replace it with our new code. So you can see at the top here it's no longer importing any variables. Okay, and we have our method here for when the button is clicked. So now how do we check whether the button is checked or not? So now what we have to do is go back into our designer and get the name of that check button. So the ID for that check button is check button 1. Okay, so back into our code. So here I'm going to create a reference to that widget. So self.checkbutton1 equal builder.get object. And the object that we want is check button 1. So this is going to get a reference to check button 1, and it's going to put it into this variable here. And this variable name is not critical. This part has to match the part that says get object and the string that we pass. This needs to match the name of the widget in Pygubu Designer, in this case, checkbutton1. But self.checkbutton1, this variable doesn't have to match. We can call this ABC and it would be fine. At that point, ABC would have a reference to checkbutton1. But just so it's easier to understand, we're going to match the name that we've given it in Pygubu Designer. Okay, so now that we have a reference to that check button, in the method that runs whenever the verify button gets clicked, we can do the following. We can say print self.checkbutton1.state, and that's a method. And let's see what that gives us. Again, I'm not going to click on check button 1. I'm just going to click on verify and see what it gives us down here in the console. Okay, so it says alternate and it's a tuple. So alternate basically means that the user has not selected checked or unchecked. It's in between. So right now, if I check it and click on verify, it's going to change to selected. If I uncheck it and click on verify, it's going to be an empty tuple. Another way of verifying to see if it's checked or not is you could say if self.checkbutton1 in state, and then you pass in a list and say selected, then you print selected, else print not selected. So this would be a fairly straightforward way of checking to see whether a check button is checked or not. And let's test it out. Okay, so I'm not going to check that check button and I'm going to click on verify. So right now this hasn't been changed at all. Not selected, that's good. And if I check it, it says selected. And if I uncheck it, it says not selected again. And if we want to make sure that the user has actually checked it or unchecked it, then we can change this. We can say if self.checkbutton1.inState, and we can say alternate, because remember, if the state is alternate, that means that there has been no decision made. You have not made a decision. And let's see that in action. Okay, if I click on verify, you have not made a decision. If I check it, it's the same line as before, so nothing happened. If I uncheck it, same thing. The last thing I'll show you is, what if we want to check a check button in code? Not by the user clicking on it, but what if we want to check the check button with our own Python code? How do we do that? So I'll show you that too. I'm going to go back into Pygubu Designer. I'm going to set up a variable. I'm going to call it the same thing as before, checkbutton_value. And I'm going to set this up as a Boolean. And I'm going to save the project. Then I'm going to generate the code again, which is here. Copy to clipboard, go into our Python IDE, and replace all that code with the new one. And now we can see the variable imported up here. So the variable self.checkbutton_value, we can also set a value. So I'm going to write set and then pass in true. And if I run this program, I'm going to click on verify, and that checked that checkbox automatically through code by just using the set method on that variable and passing in true, because that variable was also a Boolean type. So these are the ways of checking whether a check button is checked or unchecked. Whether you actually use a variable or not, it's really just a personal preference. In my opinion, if you're starting off with a new project You can decide whether to use variables for check buttons or not, but in my opinion, if you do start using variables in check buttons, it might make more sense to continue to use variables for all your check buttons in your project. But if you're, for example, working on a different project, like somebody else's code, like through GitHub, for example, or GitLab, or whichever version control system that you use, if you find that the project that you're working on isn't using variables for check buttons, it might make more sense to keep it consistent and not use variables. But if they are using variables, it might make more sense to match that in the code, just so there's some level of consistency. So using variables or not, it's really just a personal preference.
We saw how to use the check button widget. Pygubu Designer supports TK variables, which makes it easy to get values from widgets. Until the next tutorial, thanks for watching.